We're discussing the topics of leadership, service, community, and faith. It's more than being a leader, but putting action to your words. We are Serve as a Verb. We're continuing our journey of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And sometimes this looks like an idea or starting a program or an organization. But sometimes it looks like using your story to walk alongside others, making an impact one life at a time. Today's guest has done just that. She's locked arms with people who are searching for healing and freedom and helped them take their next steps toward mental health and wellness. Her name is Shawna Willis. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know Shawna, she has experience as a human resources executive, consulting in that area after moving out of full-time work. She has completed a Master's of Divinity in Leadership. She is a clergy member and a Christian counselor, and as of this last week, a doctoral candidate. That's a lot.
It is a lot. When you say it like that, it makes me go, how'd that happen? Right?
And how do you have enough time for that?
That's a question for my husband, right? You have a good support system around you, and that's what's been able to make me be able to do that, to be really honest.
Tell us, how did you discover your talent for working in human resources?
My husband and I have been married for 28 years, and I entered corporate America about 26 years ago, and I started as an executive assistant. Loved it. Found out I was really good at it, and I've been blessed. I had great leaders in corporate America who gave me, I like to say, they gave me steak and not ground chuck. And they would give me projects, whether they thought I could do it or they knew I could do it, I got it. And then they would train and teach along the way. I had some leaders who, one of them was a lieutenant colonel in the JAG, and he was the company's corporate attorney, and he was running all of their EEOC claims and some of their high-level HR stuff. And he looked at me one day and said, I'm tired of doing this. Here's a 4-inch binder. Read it. This is the last charge we had. Learn it, replicate it, and bring me back your final project. And I just stood there looking like a deer in the headlights. And that's how it started. People started giving me stuff, and they started looking at me and saying, you can do this. And before you knew it, they said, you'd be great in HR. And again, staring at them. And I bit, and off we went. I went back, got more education, learned what I needed to learn, and never looked back. And learned about 5 years into it that God had a bigger purpose for HR than I could ever guess. It wasn't a career. It was a corporate America mission field. And I was learning how to be a woman of faith and be an HR professional. And sometimes the two of them work beautifully, and sometimes you have to ask God to give you some creativity on how to take God in the workplace. And that's really how it all started.
How did you move from HR into counseling?
I love HR. And for a lot of years, I told people, you know what, this is what I was born to do. In 2020, God started to show me some things and say, your time is limited. You are not going to be able to be a woman of faith and an HR leader forever. You are either going to have to come into a situation where you deny your faith or be insubordinate. And neither of those were an option. So I went to my husband and I said, I think God's calling me out of HR. And he looked at me and he said, what does that mean? I said, I think I'm going to go back to school. Now, I had already started an MBA in leadership, and I had taken a pause from that. He's thinking I'm going to go back to my MBA. And I said, no, I think God's asking me to go to seminary for a Master of Divinity. Now, a Master of Divinity is the same degree pastors have. Chances are, if you're in a church and your pastor is ordained and has their master's, it's a Master of Divinity. And my husband looked at me and said, what are you going to do with that? I said, I have no idea. At this point, it's nothing more than an act of obedience. And that was my mantra for about a year before God used a woman in the middle of a conversation about our dogs to look at me, and she was talking about the dogs. And all of a sudden she goes, God's calling you to Christian counseling. And then she kept talking about the dogs. And I was like, my husband and I looked at each other. We locked eyes. She doesn't remember to this day saying that. And I'm so glad my husband was there because I needed a witness for this or I thought I was losing my mind. And it started from there. Now, I continue to this day to consult part-time in corporate America. I have a large client that I work a few days, and then I have a small client that I work a couple days a month. The large client, they know I have an MDiv. They know that I'm a Christian counselor. They know that's where I'm going. But they also know that I'm using those hours to balance being bivocational. So about 3-4 months before I finished my Master of Divinity, again, still consulting in corporate for HR, but part-time, I started to have doubt. God, did I hear you right? God, this doesn't make sense. I know HR. I'm seemingly good at HR. This almost feels like an old glove, an old shoe that you put on. And I almost don't have to agonize over what are my options. I can quickly assess from the years he's given me and the great leaders around me. And what I don't know, I know where to go find it, right? Are you sure this is what you want? You sure I'm leaving corporate to be a Christian counselor? And no sooner did I ask that. The following week, the federal government overturned Roe v. Wade, which is, from a believer standpoint, is beautiful, right? We don't want babies killed. We don't want abortion. And yet the other side of this is that put abortion and abortification policies on the back of employers. Guess who was going to be administering those policies within corporate? HR. So, remember God telling me, you are either going to have to choose one day whether you are a woman of faith or be insubordinate. And God revealed what that was for me in a moment of doubt. And it all came like a trifecta together. And I knew, okay, this is it. Thank you, Lord, for your grace in my doubt. And never looked back. I am still bivocational. I am counseling. I'm a licensed clinical pastoral counselor while I am doing some part-time executive consulting work. And it's been interesting because God has used that HR consulting avenue in some of my clients who need that. And then he's actually brought employees to me who have said, I heard you're a counselor. Yeah, I have a question. Okay. And the door swings open, and before you know it, you're sitting back going, oh, Lord, what did you just do? Lord, let me catch up. That kind of thing.
Are you a state licensed counselor?
Good question. No, I am not. I am, as I mentioned, a licensed clinical pastoral counselor. So what does that mean? That means that I am actually commissioned clergy. You have ordained clergy that, obviously will wed you. And then you have commissioned clergy who are like an apprenticeship to that ordained clergy, but clergy nonetheless. I am not licensed by the state. The state, while God can certainly use a state licensed counselor, their forefront is not usually biblically based for a lot of the legislative reasons. But as a pastoral counselor, we are trained on the Bible first as our platform for all wellness, emotional health, etc. Now, one of the other things that we're not psychiatrists, we're not psychologists, so we don't go into diagnostics.
What is the word that best describes your personal story?
Over and over again, it's redemption. Over and over again. I am a survivor of child abuse. I'm a transplant to Texas. So we grew up, we being my husband and I both grew up in the North. We grew up in Ohio. very much Appalachia country. And I come from a long generation of abuse. My father was abused, my mother was abused, the whole line of the grandparents. With that, it is very common for abuse to breed abuse. And it's interesting because I was talking to a client of mine about it becomes comfortable, right? Abuse and dysfunction becomes comfortable. It becomes something that we know doesn't feel quite right, and yet it's hard to separate ourselves from it because this is maybe all you know. And that was my childhood. I remember knowing this isn't normal, and yet I didn't know what normal looked like. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I went to the church through a friend, my best friend in high school, and actually she started in junior high. She invited me to her family church. And it was unbelievable, right? There was like huge difference between what was happening at home, which was you survived, right? Between that and what you experienced in church. And for me, the abuse was multifaceted. My father was an alcoholic until he went to jail. And then he became sober cold turkey because they don't give you booze in jail. So you have no choice. And he was not a happy drunk, right? He was not a happy drunk. Now, while he did not physically abuse us, I believe because of the abuse that he experienced, right? He wouldn't even spank us. But my mother struggled with rage, with anger. And looking back now at my age, I have a feeling that she probably had some undiagnosed, probably clinical and mental diagnosis that nobody really at that time caught. I'll be 50 here in a matter of weeks, and that just wasn't something that people openly discussed, sought treatment for, etc. You didn't have to do something wrong to be beaten by her. I've shared with my husband before, I remember my brother having a fight with my mother and me standing next to her and my mouth just hanging open. And I can tell you exactly what went through my mind. Why are you letting him say that? What? And she looked at me and said, "What are you looking at?" And I got punched in the face. And I never knew what logic I could put that it's a cause and effect, right? If you do, this happens. And sometimes with abuse, you can't put those two things together. And it's funny because the very first scripture I ever memorized was Proverbs 3:5-6, which says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your understanding. And always acknowledge me and I'll direct your paths." That lean not on your own understanding, that's my why. Why was this happening? It's not just my why. I know hundreds of people who look and say, why? Why does God allow that to happen? That scripture, and I can't tell you that, certainly not at that age, that I was able to grab onto everything it meant. But it's planted the seed for me to say, okay, the why may not come. But if I rely on him, he's going to direct this path. And that was one of two things in my childhood I grabbed onto like nobody's business. You weren't getting it out of my hands. That path continued. And my father was eventually released from the county jail. And I was 15 at this time. And looking back, we now know when you become sober, there is a process, there are consequences, there are things you have to look out for, such as depression, such as withdrawal, such as all those things that are all real. And he did struggle looking back with depression. And his solution to that was he committed suicide about 15 to 20 yards from me. Now, God was gracious in that. Let's go back to Proverbs 3:5-6. I will direct your path, he says. That path of protection also includes what he promises, which is, when your mother and father forsake you, the Lord will take care of you. He also promises, I will give you a sound mind. To do that, I didn't see my father actually commit it. I was heading into the house. He was in one of 3 barns. And as soon as we heard the gunshot, we being my mother and my brother and I, obviously scattered to go and figure out where that came from. And this is an important part of my story in that Proverbs 3:5-6 and the other verses I just mentioned all came together in this one night. So we run into the barns to try to figure out where he is. And I run into a barn, and I can, to this day, still see now, anybody who's grown up on a farm, the hay goes in the barn, come feeding time, the hay comes out of the barn, and you're left with this dark barn, which has leftover hay on the floor, but it's a shell waiting for the next round of hay. I grew up a tomboy. I just did. My aunts have seen me come home from corporate in like business suits, and they're like, "What are you doing?" That's not what we come from. But be that as it is, you run into the barn, and to paint the picture for you, I can still see the dark slats of wood, the dark barn, the light shining through the wood. In front of me and to the left, it's just dark and empty, and my right side is just one big wall of white, like a light. I turned around, ran out, told my mother and my brother he wasn't there. Later, the police obviously come, and I find out that he's in that barn to the right. Now, I'm convinced to this day that was an angel shielding me from seeing his dead body on that ground. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and he will direct your paths. Now, he didn't keep this from me in that there were consequences to that. To this day, I'm still very easy to scare. Loud noises don't go well with me. I remember walking across campus at college my freshman year. We were poor, and I got to school grants, scholarships, federal funding. And I'm walking across campus, and I heard a car backfire. And I remember, I can tell you where I am on the pathway. And it's interesting because our son goes to that school now. And we'll visit him and we'll walk on that sidewalk. And I can tell you where I'm standing when I heard that car backfire. And I didn't think that was a gunshot. And that's a big deal because from 15 to that point, if I heard a big bang, the first thing that resonated with me was it was a gunshot. And I remember standing in the sidewalk to the college campus, like almost frozen. That was a car backfiring. That wasn't a gunshot. And in that rapid moment through my head, it was the realization, God's doing something. Redemption is possible. Now, did I know that redemption was really redemption? The much bigger impact? I can tell you no. Because I was still on the baby steps of healing at that point. But that gave me the hope of what then projected the rest of my adulthood. When I left for college, that church that I had been invited to had actually been rallying around me for years because my friend invited me, I think, in like junior high. At this point, I'm getting ready, fast forward to leave for college. And my childhood pastor of that church said something to me that was my second lifeline that I did not let go of. Remind you, one hand over here, I got Proverbs 3:5-6. My other hand, my pastor looks at me and he says, God is going to use you to break the cycles in your family. Now, you want to talk about, whoa, what, huh? I can honestly tell you, I don't know that I knew everything about that either. But I left that church and going to college with both of those things white-knuckled in my hand. And that has been part of that journey on and on. And to this day, I tell people very discerningly, because they have to be ready to hear it. I think my pastor said that in a time that was beyond strategic. God is strategic. Communication is strategic. I think he knew I was ready to hear it. The next week, I was on my way to Kentucky for college. So it does take discernment to say when a person is ready for them to be able to absorb the truth that God has ready for them. But I turned 50 in a few weeks, and I got to tell you, that is still gripped in my hand.
How can someone distinguish their identity from their upbringing?
What I love about that question is the wrestle that we struggle with that I mentioned in the beginning, right? We can look around us. We can see that these are our people, and yet also see there's something that doesn't feel right about this. This dysfunction doesn't, it's like sandpaper. I need this paper to smooth out this desk, and yet it doesn't necessarily feel completely right. And that's the tug of war between distinguishing our identity as a DNA member of that family and understanding that we're also part of God's family. I won't tell you my maiden name to obviously be respectful to my family, but I will tell you that in the small county that I grew up, if you said my maiden name, it comes with an immediate recognition. You know how we watch TV shows and they say, this name and that name equals the mob family, right? Now, let's be clear. I didn't come from a mob family. But you say my maiden name family, and they know in that county they're dysfunctional. And it's heartbreaking because they wear it almost as a badge of honor from the generational side, right? Now, I will tell you, this is diminishing some because the matriarch has passed, the patriarch has passed, my father has passed, and some of his siblings are, so we're getting into fourth generation at this time. And I think that's diminishing because the later generations are distinguishing between their identity as that family member and there's something better, there's something bigger, right? I think one of the ways that it's important to distinguish yourself from your family members is to just be honest with God. Part of my MDiv was to do a class assignment on the book of Habakkuk. When's the last time you read Habakkuk?
Yeah. Ever? I don't know.
I, to this day, have to go to the table of context to find Habakkuk. Let me just tell you that. And I remember when we were given this assignment, it was to do a deep dive of Habakkuk. So let me give you a high level. Habakkuk is a minor prophet. There are 3 chapters. And I think in my Bible, it covers the front of one page, the back of a page, and the top quarter of a third page. And I got this assignment, and I went, huh? I don't know. I'm going to do this. I'm going to study this. I don't even know what this is. I'm not even sure I'm saying is right? But then when you dive into Habakkuk, one of the things that really punches you in the face is 2 things. The first one is how candid he was with God. The very first chapter of Habakkuk talks right out of the gate with Habakkuk almost being like rude to God. He goes, how long are you going to stand by and listen to my cries and do nothing? Your eyebrows are going up. And I'm reading this and going, ooh, I'm not sure I can say that to God. Then it goes on. And God responds, God's patient, and he listens to Habakkuk, and God says, I am about to do something that your mind can't even fathom. One of the things that's most impactful of that is that verse 5 where God says, I'm going to blow your mind. And that's Shawna's version, right? I'm going to blow your mind. But that's what he's saying. Your mind won't be able to even fathom this. And you're probably thinking to yourself, why is that even important in identifying yourself and distinguishing between who you are and what you were as an upbringing? It's because in a dysfunctional family, we're not taught it's okay to be brutally honest. That's hard. You learn to keep secrets well. You learn that if you're part of this family, you're not going to talk about the abuse. You're not going to call somebody out. That's not okay. And yet Habakkuk is over here telling God, just this is how it is, giving him a piece of his mind. And God patiently sits there and says, but I'm doing something that you can't even begin to fathom. To distinguish your identity from your upbringing, it means that you have to break the molds that you're taught in that upbringing. And you have to take those practices that you're told don't do. Don't call garbage. You don't graciously call, hey guys, this isn't okay to behave this way. Don't do that. But to distinguish that, you have to be willing to take this to God and be willing to ask him for guidance on that. One of the scriptures that we all love is the Jeremiah 29:11, where he reminds Jeremiah that he knows the plans that I have for you, and they're plans for good and not evil. It's interesting because we all like to stop there, right? Don't fear, for I know the plans I have for you, they're for good and not for evil. And we want to stop right there. But I don't even know anymore. I'm going to sit on that, right? But if you go on, now that's Jeremiah 29:11, but if you go on to verse 12, God goes on to say, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you actually seek me, and I will restore your fortunes. You hear the redemption in that? You hear the restoration in that? I'm a big fan of word studies. So you grab a word out of the scriptures and you dive deep. I think it goes back into my HR days where when we did employee investigations, which I still am called in to do now and then, and somebody will make one little statement, not unlike what the PD does. Somebody makes one statement and your antennas go, and you're like, oh, let's go back to that statement. I love word studies. I looked up the word fortune in this passage because we think money, we think wealth, we think comfort. There's a really great resource called the Keyword Bible. And what it does is it highlights specific words, and then you can go back at the back of the Bible and look up the original Hebrew or the Greek. And it'll blow your mind how deep these words are beyond what our English language can do, okay, in the translation. So I looked up the word fortune, and it means not only, it does mean comfort things like some of your money, but it also means from the original Hebrew, the chief use was in declaring the liberating power of the Lord and releasing his people from such banishment. That's from the Keyword Bible. That's a little different to me than restore your funds back to you. And what he's saying here is that God's promise and plan for us, and it's all of us, right, is that he is going to restore our redemption in him. He doesn't say that's going to happen based off of who our parents are, who our people are, right? What it says is that if we call on him, that he's going to do that. And I think that's important in saying, look, I have no choice, right? I get that a lot from people. I don't have a choice. And the truth of the matter is we all have choices. We have a choice whether to choose God or not. As a police officer, I'm sure you encounter this all the time, right? People who make good choices or didn't. They chose to run that red light, right? But that's the crux of distinguishing from whom we come from and who God wants us to be. There's a great training conference that happens every year by Lisa Harper. She calls it Charisma Summit, in which she brings in all these seminary professors into a Nashville area. And for 2.5 days, it is literally seminary training without having to go to seminary. And one of the profs they bring in, his name is Dr. Jim Howard. I love listening to him. And he says that we have to approach how we read the Bible with a lens. What do you see when you read the scriptures? Do you see God of love? That's perfectly acceptable. But another option is a God of redemption. And if you start from the Old to the New Testament, God demonstrates his love through redemption. And none of that is a condition of whom we came from, our family. God actually defines family much bigger than DNA.
So how did you find healing from your family?
The first thing that I would say is I had to embrace the path of healing, right? It's easy to stuff and not deal with things. And you do that, and God's going to always bring it to light. You go back to the scripture on light. I'll tell you the biggest thing once I made that decision that, okay, I wanted healing, came with the conviction that I was being called as a believer to look at the people around me through God's eyes. That's hard. That's the part of grace. We like grace. I like grace. I like to accept grace. But that's the hard part of giving grace, right? It's the hard part when I'm put in a situation where, okay, I have to give this person grace. What does that look like? How do I even start to understand that as a fallen human? Part of my training as a Christian counselor is on temperament theory. Temperament is similar to personality, except that your personality is a mask you can put on. Your temperament is how God created you with your unique set of needs. Okay? That being said, we're all created by God with a unique set of needs. Your needs aren't necessarily bad, but temperament counseling helps you to understand your needs and then helps you to get those needs met in a godly manner. Why is that even important in the story of healing? Because that comes with the same type of requirement that I just mentioned as a believer. We are called to see things through God's eyes. God didn't say it was easy. He just said, do it. He said, read my words, study me, learn me, etc. So one of the things that I learned very early on was that my parents couldn't meet my needs. My mother couldn't love me the way I wanted to be loved. My father, even on his best days, wasn't capable of being that vulnerable. I remember being 12 and asking my father if I was pretty. Every girl wants their dad to say, Daddy's little girl, yeah, you're beautiful. And mine said, yeah, you're pretty ugly. And at this age, I have an amazing husband who out of the blue will look at me and say, you're beautiful. And I go, huh? Because we still have those memories impressed in our head. And yet the reality was I was hurting because my parents refused to love me, is what it looked like. Now, when I stepped back and said, okay, God, you tell me what I'm supposed to see here. And God said, you're asking them for something they can't give you. That hit me hard. What do you mean, God? I'm asking them for something they can't give me. They're my parents. They're supposed to be able to do that, right? They're supposed to not hurt me. But the more I learned this, it would be like me asking you to perform brain surgery. Can you do that?
No.
Okay. Why not?
I can't.
I can't.
I'm not trained. I don't have the education nor the patience.
Okay. All of those are true for me too. I can't do brain surgery. I am incapable. You and I are incapable of doing that. I had to get to a point where saw that my mother wasn't capable of what I was asking her to do. Why? I don't necessarily know why, right? But I can tell you that when I realized that she was at her maximum capacity in loving me, things changed. I came home from college. It was my freshman year. And I had already moved out of the house. Now, I was held back in second grade for slow reading. And I didn't graduate until I was 19 because of that. Did you see that? I had to do the math. With that, when my father died, at that time, I don't know all the ins and outs of it today, but at that time, the Social Security, you would get a check as a death benefit. My brother got one and I got one. And it was nominal in today's terms. Like it was, I think, $400 a month for me. And a church member said to me, he and his wife said, "Why are you still there?" Now, mind you, I was turning 18 in a matter of months. And he said, "Why are you still there? Why haven't you just moved out and gone to live with a family member?" Now, mind you, I lived in Timbuktu. Like, we were on a farm. So for me to get to school, I needed wheels. For me to move out, I had to move pretty far away from the school. So I still needed wheels, right? And I said, "Well, how am I going to do that? I don't even have a car." He said, "Did you ask God?" What? It never crossed my mind to ask God for a car. And I can tell you where I was kneeling and praying. And I was looking out this window, out my bedroom, and there was this big pine tree that we used to climb in. And the dogs laid there. And I can still see all of this when I tell you this story. I'm literally on my knees, almost like Habakkuk, going, "You know what, God? You're not going to hear this. You're not even going to do this. This isn't even in your ability. But fine. I'm doing this because they said to do this. God, if it's your will for me to leave this house, I need you to give me a car. All right, God, I'm going to go find some ice cream." It was that lackluster. Almost 2 weeks later, my uncle, who was my father's brother, non-believer, called me. And he said, "Hey, I have a Delta 88. Do you know what that is? Do you know what a Delta 88? It's a diesel. It looks like a Lincoln. It's extremely long vehicle, and it rode like a tank. And when you went over a bump, it was like a big old boat, and it was ugly. Oh my goodness, it was ugly." And he said, "I've tuned the engine up, and I've put new tires on it, and it's yours. You're the oldest grandchild. It's yours if you want it." Just telling you that story made my stomach flip-flop. It was a halfway conversation with God that I even asked for that, right? And he answered that prayer. And when I went to my mother and I said, "I'm moving out," the only thing she said to me is, "You're not taking that Social Security check." And when I came back that freshman year from college, I had been out. I lived with an aunt. I came back to visit my mother. And she looked at me. I'm not dating anybody. I'm not engaged. And she said, "When are you going to give me a grandchild?" It would have been perfectly acceptable for me to had a baby out of wedlock outside of God's will for her. But do you see her limitations? She didn't see anything wrong with that. And every one of these examples hurt deep. And yet, I was able to see eventually, it didn't happen in a heartbeat. And anybody who tells you, boom, you're gonna be healed in a heartbeat, there are examples over examples in the scriptures of God healing physically, miraculously, and instantaneously. But if you look at the scriptures, even Paul says, "I've asked 3 times for something to be removed, and God has not yet removed it." Emotional healing tends to be progressive, even in the scriptures. This was a big step for me to progressively learn I don't think she's trying to hurt me. I think she's at capacity. If I needed neurosurgery right now, you're not trying to hurt me. That's outside of your capacity. And likewise. And when we start to see people through God's eyes, that what if I'm asking something from them that they can't give to me? My experience has been that healing starts to grow. Gradually, but it starts to grow. It's almost as though God prepared me for the next step of understanding forgiveness.
How do we move towards forgiveness?
One of the things that I think is the biggest lesson that I learned about forgiveness comes with the fact that it's a gift for me, not the person who offended me. In my scenario, it was God's love and gift to me. He didn't justify my mother and her actions and her abuse, and yet he didn't want me handcuffed by the burden of unforgiveness. And I think that's where it has to start, right? I was reading just the other day in Matthew, the latter part of chapter 18. And I told you I love words. So even today I'll read scripture and the smallest little word will hit me square between the eyes. And there's two passages that have done that for me. The first one is the Matthew 18. So I'm reading this a couple weeks ago. And the story is the parable of the man who was forgiven by either a king or a rich man who owed him like 10,000 currency. And the rich man forgave him. And the man who was forgiven bebops off into his life. And then another man owes him 10, whatever that currency is. And he didn't forgive him. The scripture says, so this man who was forgiven by the king, but refusing to forgive the person who owed him, threw the person who owed him into jail until he could pay the debt. And I got stopped in my tracks. Until he can pay the debt. Now, if he's in jail, he can't work. If he can't work, he can't pay the debt. Therefore, to be in jail until you can pay the debt is a death sentence. And I understand the scripture for a long time. Anybody who's a believer has been taught, you forgive because God forgave you. But if you read this parable and you look at the hook, this man went to jail until he could pay the debt. You see, it's a death sentence. That's what lack of forgiveness is. Forgiveness releases you from that death sentence. I either carry around all of this abuse, all of this anger, all of this disdain for my mother, which, by the way, she passed many years ago. And it affects me personally. It doesn't affect her. Or I forgive and I'm out of the cycle of the death sentence. Does that make sense? Do you see what smacked me in the face? That I wrestled with for years until it fully worked its way in me that God is not offering forgiveness and then commanding forgiveness from me to others because he doesn't resonate with my pain and because he doesn't love me. He loves me so much. He doesn't want me to carry the burden of the death sentence that's represented there in Matthew 18. And that could be really hard for any of us to wrestle with because, again, it's progressive, right? It takes us time. And yet, God uses time to get us ready for this stuff. One of the other stories that one day, I've known it since I was a kid, is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And this happened, I think, last year. I was rereading that story. and got to a couple words, and it stopped me in my tracks, and I was like, back up. And that is where they come to Jesus and say, we need you to come. Lazarus is sick. And they're expecting him to heal Lazarus. And the passage reads, because Jesus loved them, he stayed where he was. Holy cow. Well, back it up. What do you mean because he loved them? We want to believe that because he loved us, he would run to heal Lazarus. But he didn't. Because he loved them, he stayed where he was. We have to look at forgiveness and healing a little bit different, right? I have had to look at it different. If you keep reading the story of Lazarus, had Jesus ran to heal him, he wouldn't have been able to raise him from the dead. Wow, right? And that's so hard for us to sit through the waiting to get to the miraculous on the other side. But that's what healing and forgiveness is. It is the working through of that pain in an effort to be released from the death sentence for that greater blessing from God. So what does that look like for me now? And what do I do with that? Had I not had that journey, I wouldn't be able to help others do that. I also would have been eaten alive. And let's go back to what my childhood pastor said, right? God's going to use you to break the cycles in your family. My husband and I will celebrate 28 years of marriage in August and start 29. How can that happen if I am caught up in the cog of the dysfunctional cycles of generational dysfunction?
When a client asks why God allows this pain to happen, what do you tell them?
More people ask me that when you're sharing your faith than I can count. I think the best example is a lesson that came from my son. Our son has a heart disease. He has Kawasaki disease. And he's had that since he was 2. And he came to me when he was about 9 and said, Mom, why would God allow me to have a heart disease? And I said, I don't know. And a while later, maybe about a month later, I was reading. And I was reading in John, I believe it's chapter 9, where the Pharisees bring this man to Jesus who's been blind since birth. And they say, this man has been blind from birth because of his sins and the sins of his father. And this is the story where Jesus spits in the dirt, mixes the mud and his spit together, puts it on the man's eyes, and he goes off and he's healed. And the scripture says that Jesus turned to them and looked at him and said, this man was not blind because of his sins or the sins of his fathers. He was blind so I could be glorified in this moment right here, right now. And I got all excited that day. I figured this out. When I read this, I was like, I had to run and tell my son Jordan, I'm like, hey, dude, I know why God allowed you to have a heart disease. And I said, so I read the story to him, and I said, dude, God allowed you to have a heart disease so God could be glorified through the heart disease. You know what he did? He looked at me, and mind you, he's 9, and he goes, do we have any peanut butter and jelly? It answered his question. He moved on so fast that we as adults, we don't do that fast, right? We don't go on to peanut butter and jelly. But he did. This story and this interaction of God using this man. Now, let's be real. We don't know how old that man was. He was probably blind for at least a decade. longer, right? But all those years for that one encounter, and that encounter to have the Messiah spit on your face, right? And the power that came from that action for God to be glorified in that very moment. And that may be hard to wrestle with when you're hurting. And the goal is never to minimize the pain of those who are suffering. But would it be easier if we knew what God was trying to do with that pain? It would have been easier for me. If God had told me when I was 15, hey, that woman is going to need somebody who understands what it's like to hear a 12-gauge shotgun for somebody who's committing suicide, and you're the one who knows it and not that person, I'm not telling you I would have done it. I'm telling you it would have given my pain at that day purpose. And that's what God has done. And there are times in our suffering when we want to know why, right? And this passage, among others, reminds us that what if it's being allowed because God is being glorified through it? Wow, that's humbling that God would even think that I'm worthy enough to even to hold that as a vessel for him. And yet, it makes it a lot easier to say, we got any peanut butter and jelly? If I know God is going to use this for his good.
How did you learn healthy habits, and what are those habits that sustain you?
I always tell people, I think I heard this from a professor. We all pay for our education in some way. You either hand over a check for tuition and you learn, or you stub your toe pretty darn hard and you figure that out that way. Or let's hope that we don't all just break our kneecaps along the way and that's our lesson, right? But I did. I had to learn. I had to learn what was not healthy, what was ungodly. I had to apologize and recognize my place and many marital arguments that were flashbacks to what I saw and yet still needed to learn from. You know, I go back to what I say. I'm not unique. I'm not special. I have to learn the same way everybody else does, right? While I am blessed to be redeemed and on the other side of healing, my lessons are still learning. There are times, no joke, there's times I open my mouth to say something to my husband and I can hear a snarky comment go through my head that any one of my family members could have said. And there was one time we were driving down the road and I went to go open my mouth and I literally heard God say, "Daughter, close your mouth." And I was like, okay. That's the first habit that I have had to really embrace, which is I have a choice. One of the biggest challenges in HR is when employees say, I have no choice. Why did you do that? I had no choice. Sure you did. We all have choices. And in fact, that's the hallmark of the tenet of our faith, which is free will. Healthy behaviors have to come with me saying to myself, I have a choice. Am I going to say, God, go away, because that snarky comment that's coming through my mind, it's coming out? Or am I going to bite the insides of my cheek and just shut my mouth? That's the first thing that I would say that is really powerful for me. When I gave my life to Christ as a teenager, I was 11 or 12, my mother put me in counseling. And she put me in counseling because she thought something was wrong with me because I was now praying. I was now reading the Bible. I was now talking about God. There's scripture that talks about the power of light. Light dispels darkness, right? And I think once I gave my life to Christ, I was now a thorn in their side. So she put me in counseling. Unbeknownst to her, she didn't really understand the side effects of what that was going to do, because the counselor recognized the abuse pretty quickly. The counselor recognized the alcoholism that was raging in the house. And she gave me a book called Adult Children of Alcoholics. And I still have that copy to this day. And it was way over my head. But there were a few key things that came out of that stuck with me. And one of them was that there are choices that an adult child of an alcoholic makes because they think it's going to keep them safe, but it's not needed. For example, it says in there, the psychologist says that adult children of alcoholics will start to lie even when they don't have to. And I'm not sure I understand, or I'm going to talk about all of the psychological stuff that goes around why that happens for children. And I'm an adult child of alcoholics. But that was one of those things that, again, reminded me, I have a choice. I'm choosing to do this. It's not something that I have no choice. So that's the first thing. When I'm looking at how am I going to respond, am I going to respond this way or this way? And sometimes you got to rapid fire that one in the midst of it, right? A while back, I had a counseling client who said something insulting to me in the middle of the session. I don't think she sent it through her filter. But my first response was, in my mind was, what'd you say? And immediately I heard God say, show her. What do you mean? Show her the healthy way, the godly way to do this. And I'm going to be transparent because there's no reason not to be, right? But inside I was like, crumb, right? Okay, I'm choosing to do this, God, right? And isn't that what happens when God puts something in front of us? Sometimes we go, sure, let's go. Happy to do it. Other times we go, crumb. Do I have to do that? Yes. Yes, daughter, you have to do that. But we have choices. So that's a big thing that was a game changer for me. The second habit that really changed my life was from the book Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. My childhood church had gone through that book as a church-wide activity, Sunday night Bible study. And one of the things that Henry Blackaby teaches in there is that we are in the middle of a circumstance. And we are called to try to find the truth in this circumstance. And what we end up doing is we can either look for truth or we could make decisions and choices based on the assumptions of what we think is true. Two different things, okay? Henry Blackaby says the only way to know the truth of the circumstance is to look at it from way up here where God looks at it, who can see the whole circumstance. He can see all truths of it. From there, one of the things that I use when I get into what I call an emotional storm is I will sit down and say, and I'll even do this on paper. To this day, I still do this on paper. What do I know to be true? And I force myself to say, I will not sit here in this emotional storm and live on assumptions. I will try to identify facts of what I know to be true. Let me give you an example. I was a senior director of HR at this time. This was a couple years ago. And something happened, and I can't remember what it was. Somebody may have just said something in passing, right? And all of a sudden, my insecurity, my past, came up, smacked me right across the face, and an emotional storm started. And inside me, like an anxiety attack, as you would describe it, started to say, oh my goodness, why didn't I get that project? Wait a minute, is my boss mad at me? Which, by the way, is a huge byproduct of being an abused child. For years, I would ask people, are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? Like every 10 minutes. It was insatiable. You could never satisfy the fear that you were mad at me. And that came back in that moment that day in my office when I was in this circumstance at the corporate. And the anxiety just kept going. They're mad at me. They must not think I can do my job. What are they doing? Well, why aren't they coming to me now? All of this, none of it was real. And it was paralyzing me. And I literally pulled out a piece of paper and said, God, I have to make this stop. Help me make this stop. So I went back to Henry Blackaby's model. What do I know to be true? I'm going to force myself to look at this circumstance from God's eyes. So I wrote down on a piece of paper, what do I know to be true? Okay, I have 5 active projects on my plate. Maybe my boss didn't give it to me because she knows I'm already overwhelmed. If they didn't trust me, fact number 2, if they didn't trust me, why would I have 5? Fact number 3, 3 of these are legal issues. If I was incompetent, why would I have legal issues? Do you see how the process works? And just like light dispels darkness, truth dispels assumptions and lies. And there are times, even to this day, that I will use this. I've taught this model in corporate America. I really have. I've said, okay, you 2 employees aren't getting along. What is the truth of this situation? Or how they each have their own version, right? And you bring them together and you teach a model of Henry Blackaby's circle here of truth. And okay, folks, let's step outside of this situation over here. Now, what is a fact? Not an assumption and not your feelings. I want to know the facts. And before you know it, we have a whole whiteboard full of facts and 2 people are now getting along. And that is a habit that even when Satan wants to come up and smack me in the face, that I do to this day. I'll probably do that until the day I die.
As we've been talking, someone may be feeling a stirring or a pull to counseling. If somebody wanted to pursue that, what guidance would you give them?
I am licensed through the National Christian Counseling Association, and I definitely encourage you to start researching what that looks like if that's what you wanted to do. But even as you research, there's one big thing I would tell you to do is make sure that God is calling you to that and all that entails. Because it is no shame if you're not called to Christian counseling, but you're called somewhere else. And it delights God for you to be where He is calling you to be. And He'll prepare you for that. Our pastor at our church tells us all the time, God does not call the equipped. He equips those whom He calls. What is the journey that you've had that God is using to prepare you for a calling? And we tend to think of that, okay, these are my circumstances. God is just going to make those work. Take this circumstance and shove it into this pie pan and make it in the shape of the pie. But the truth of the matter is that God is already on step 1 when He ordained those circumstances. I am not counseling and helping women towards healing by accident, and it's not a byproduct that God just chose to use. God put me on a path to be able to empathize with them. Now, I'm not called to be a pastor, and I'm okay with that. That's the legwork, I would say, is by all means to start researching Christian counseling certification and the licensure process. Wrestle with that calling. Once you've been called to Christian counseling, there are 3 things that I have learned through the process that I will tell you are paramount. The first one is make sure you invest in communication. Let's go back to what I told you I teach my son all the time, right? Communication is strategic. God is a God of strategy. And you can see that all through the Old Testament, right? You can even see that in Jesus' ministry when He heals somebody and then He says, go and don't tell people, right? Why would you not tell people? Because strategically, He had a plan. Now, He knew they were going to talk, but be that as it is, He was a God of strategy. You can't just be a counselor and not put careful thought into your words. Actually, the bar is really high, really high. Go back to the example that I gave to you. God's going to call you to model some tough things. And you're either going to learn on the fly like I did and go, oh, crumb, but okay, let's go. Or you can work through that ahead of time. But be ready to be diligent about your communication. The second thing that I would tell you is know your theology. Invest in theology. You don't need a master's of divinity to be a Christian counselor. I can tell you, I'm not sure how I would do it without it. We use the Bible as our foundation for healing. Now, we do learn, as a certified and licensed Christian counselor, we learn a lot of traditional counseling and psychological items. Some, so we're aware that those are not applicable to the scriptures, and some because they are applicable and useful. But you need to know your theology. You also need to know and understand spiritual warfare. Because when you start to help people towards healing, Satan gets ticked off right and left. And you need to be ready for that. You need to be ready to put the time into recognizing that. A while back, I was counseling someone, and in the middle of the session, this person said something, and immediately they regretted it. We talked through it. It wasn't towards me. It was towards their situation. And just before we closed in prayer, I felt like this weight on me. And my thought was, did that just land on me? That's what I thought. I will tell you, I believe, say that there was a demon that went off of her and tried to come onto me. Now, that may sound controversial to you and some people, but the reality is the scriptures tell us this is not about flesh and blood. And when you start to help somebody heal emotionally, you need to be ready to fight through with your full armor and recognize it. The last thing that I would say is that I've learned on the spot is ready to be organized, right? You can get pulled in a lot of directions as a Christian counselor, and you want yourself to be organized. I had a pastor, he's actually a prof with my Master of Divinity, who said, if we are not organized, structured, and maintain our spiritual disciplines as a pastor, as a Christian counselor, you could look up and realize that what you started with is like floating in the ocean, right? You started at mile marker 1, and the tide is taking you to mile marker 50, and you're miles away from where you started. Make sure that you're organized with that.
So, Shawna, once you earn your doctorate, what's the next step for you?
I think I'll probably maintain being a bivocational Christian counselor for a while, because what that does is it allows me to part-time consult in HR and yet still maintain the Christian counseling practice. But the bivocational part, I don't think that mission field of corporate is gone yet. I don't think that's done yet. So I think that'll probably be maintained. If God opens doors, what I'd love to do is to train other Christian counselors, as well as maybe even teach. My thesis and my dissertation is about the integration of counseling and discipleship. What does that look like, right? It's one thing for us just to counsel somebody, but it's another thing to teach them, okay, what do I do with this now, right? And what do I do with my faith with this now? Because they can't be exclusive. You can't do that. If not, then that's we're not a Christian counselor. But we're also called to disciple. That's the Great Commission, right? Go and make disciples. And what does that mean? And in the context of I take this healing path, how does that merge with the discipleship path? So that's my dissertation, because I love exploring the scripture. I love, like I said, finding those words that go, look at that. wow, why didn't I see that before? So that's the plan, is to help others who are called to be Christian counselors. Always be open to bivocational if there's somebody there that God says go, then I'm going to be willing to go.
So give us one final thought.
Okay, final thought would be that we are not destined to be defined by our past. We want to sometimes wear our past like a big leather coat that weighs you down. And the reality is that is not God's will. Your past can be used for His good. Your past can be used to help somebody else, but it does not need to be something that is worn like a big badge on you. There was a time when anybody I met knew I was a survivor of abuse. Today, I have a lot of folks who hear my testimony and tell me afterwards, I never would have guessed you came from that. That's not me. That is God's redemption demonstrated through me. That's it. And one of the things that has done that that God's used and done that in my life has been the people He puts around me. When you come from a dysfunctional family and you determine that you're going to put those boundaries in place and say, I'm not going to be part of the duplication of that, then what happens is there is a pain that comes from that. There's a sadness and sometimes a loneliness because you get left out of those events that are heavily dysfunctional, and yet those are your people over there. So God will give you new people. One of the things I tell folks all the time is God does not define family by DNA alone. My husband was a huge player in my healing. And not because he has a psychological degree, but because he was my husband, because he was a man of God. There are other people that God has crossed paths with in my life, and they have been players in that healing. And they have become family that we share no DNA in. My people over here who are dysfunctional, I love them. I continue to pray for them, but I do have boundaries. My people here that we're all working to follow God's will, guess what? God's using them for that healing. And I would tell people, be on the lookout for those people because God will send them. I've had women who I met them because they pinched my elbow and I looked at them and said, hi. And they said, God told me I'm to pray with you. Okay. And now we're prayer warriors together. We have a lot of people in our lives like that. But you got to look. You got to pay attention. You got to look. And don't think that just DNA is the only way God defines family, because He doesn't.
Thank you for taking time away from your family and your practice, walking us through redemption and how we can use our stories to help others heal and grow. It's been a blessing.
Thank you. This has been fun. I appreciate you listening to my story.
Thank you for listening, and this is Serve as a Verb.
This one crazy, bro. Baby, I think I let you down. Driving through the city with the windows down. Cold in my face right now. Is this real or fake? That's one thing that I can't change. I can't. This me, I stay the same. No girl gon' change my ways. That's the thing I live by day to day. Like, no girl can change my ways.